COVID-19, Kung Flu, the Chinese virus.
Aloha from the East West Center in Honolulu, and mahalo to viewers around the world for tuning into today's EW Seminars Live webinar, Asian Americans Unsilenced. As our EWC Seminars Live series is designed for multinational journalists and informed audiences to connect, inform, and source media stories, the series frequently calls attention to and seeks to elevate public understanding of topics that are politically charged, culturally significant, and emotionally difficult. Today's webinar, reflecting on the wave of racialized attacks targeting Asian American communities, is one such example of this ongoing work. The Seminars Live team stands with allies across communities of color in solidarity against xenophobia, discrimination, and racist violence in all its forms. And we thank our viewers for joining us. My name is Liz A. Dorn, and I'm a program coordinator here at the center. It's my pleasure to introduce today's panel of prominent Asian Americans giving voice to the discrimination they've faced, the importance of allyship, and best practices in raising awareness, challenging stereotypes, and ensuring greater equality for the many different groups under the Asian American umbrella. Congressman Ted Lieu was first elected to represent California's 33rd Congressional District in the House of Representatives in 2014. He currently serves on the House Judiciary and Foreign Affairs Committees and as a whip of the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus. Congressman Lieu is a leader against ethnic and racial profiling and discrimination against the LGBTQI community. Ms. Manju Kulkarni is Executive Director of the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council, a coalition of over 40 community-based organizations, which represent the 1.5 million Asian Pacific Islanders in Los Angeles County. She is also co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate and serves as a lecturer in the Asian American Studies Department at UCLA. Mr. Rizwan Manju is an actor best known for his role in the NBC comedy Outsourced and his award-winning performance in Schitt's Creek. He is currently shooting the Netflix comedy Wedding Season and can next be seen on Netflix's Atypical. Ms. Madeline Xuan Trang Milka is a nationally recognized civil rights leader and a member of USA Today's inaugural Leaders of Change. As president and CEO of the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, she brings 25 years of experience working in political training and campaigns. Finally, Mrs. Kimmy Yam is an award-winning journalist known for helping launch HuffPost's Asian Voices section. Today, she is a reporter for NBC's Asian American section, where she aims to uplift communities that have largely been forgotten by the media ecosystem. And now I would like to take a moment to share our webinar protocols. Today's webinar is on the record, recorded on Zoom, and made available on YouTube for viewing and sharing. Viewers, your microphones and videos are turned off. Each panelist will speak for up to 7 minutes, and Q&A will take place after panelists' remarks. To submit a question, please use the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom screen and specify if there's a particular panelist you wish to answer. Join the conversation on Twitter using hashtag EWC Seminars Live and follow us on Twitter and Instagram at EWC Seminars. Check our website for webinar information, registration, full speaker bios, and YouTube links at www.eastwestcenter.org/EWC Seminars Live. From there, you can also access information about other professional opportunities, as the center offers a diverse array of media, leadership, and educational programs. Finally, I am delighted to introduce today's moderator, Miss Ashley Westerman, an award-winning journalist, audio producer, and EWC alumni, soon to be based in Manila, Philippines. Her experience as an Asian adoptee in Kentucky has informed much of her reporting on the AAPI community and led her to become an outspoken advocate for more diversity in news media. And with that, I'll hand over the program to our moderator to offer brief contextualizing remarks. Ashley?
Thank you, Liz. Good evening. Well, evening here in DC. Good day to everyone, wherever you might be. So, in my line of work, as a journalist, as many of you all are, I'm sure, I'm at the forefront of the day's news. Whether I'm logged into work or at home, doom scrolling on Twitter. I usually get word of things happening soon after they happen. So when 8 people lost their lives last month when a gunman rampaged through spas outside of Atlanta, killing 6 Asian Americans, 4 of them women, I saw it on Twitter pretty much as soon as the news broke. And when 8 people were shot and killed last week at a FedEx warehouse near the Indianapolis airport, 4 of them members of the Sikh community, I woke up to an email in my NPR inbox confirming that news. It was literally the first thing I saw. And every time a Vilma Kari or a Xiao Shungjin gets attacked while simply walking down the street while being Asian, I usually see that kind of news and those videos going viral pretty soon after it happens as well. So I'm seeing all these things over and over and over again, as I'm sure many of you all have or are. And but what I'm not seeing a lot of when these things happen, when these stories break, is that while shocking, not a lot of it, it's not new. Violence against Asian Americans is not new. And very often these incidents are just not putting into context the long history of anti-Asian xenophobia, bigotry, and violence in the US. Here's a stat that you've likely heard if you've been paying attention. According to a report issued by the Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism at California State University, San Bernardino, hate crimes against Asian Americans rose by nearly 150%. Let me say that again, 150% in 2020. And that's actually despite hate crimes dropping by 7% overall. And the first surge in this violence happened during March and April of last year, just as the COVID-19 pandemic really started ramping up here in the US. And, since the start of the pandemic, according to the Pew Research Center and the nonprofit Stop Asian American Pacific Islander, AAPI, hate, they've documented 3,795 racially motivated attacks against Asian Americans from March 2020 and February 2021. And just a note, 2/3 of these altercations were against women. But these things don't happen in a vacuum. So the context is what I am at least seeing is missing in a lot of these stories. And it goes further back than the pandemic. Many of us know this, and the labeling of COVID-19 as the Chinese virus or Kung flu, and even further back than China's ascension as a trade and cultural rival to the US during the Trump administration. It actually starts with the Page Exclusion Act of 1875. And that was the first restrictive federal immigration law in the US, which prohibited East Asian women from entering the country because they were deemed undesirable. And an unfortunate side effect consequence of that law was the fetishization of Asian women. So that's where it started. And then, I'm just going to run through some of these just to put some context with this. 7 years later came the Chinese Exclusion Act, which halted nearly all immigration from China for over 60 years and denied citizenship to Chinese already living in the US. And during World War II, 120,000 Japanese Americans were sent to internment camps after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. Fast forward 1979, Southeast Asian immigrant fishermen were attacked in Texas by the Ku Klux Klan. And then in the 80s, the murder of Vincent Chan in Detroit by two white attackers who assumed he was Japanese and had stolen work from American auto workers. 1992, the anti-Korean riots in Los Angeles, and of course, the post 9/11 violence towards Muslims, Sikhs, and people of Arab and South Asian descent. This is just a truncated timeline. This is not all of the incidents. I don't have enough time to talk about that. And this, of course, does not include US conquest, war, colonialism of Asia and the Pacific that have further shaped the way American society view people from Asia. And so I could go on, but I won't. And with this, all of this context, we must consider the toll that it's taken on Asian America, on our businesses, our relationships with other ethnic groups, our mental health, and our psyche. And it permeates through all levels of our community, new immigrants, older generations, younger generations, and even Asian adoptees like myself. So how are we dealing with this today, which is why we're here to talk about this amid a surge in anti-Asian violence we see now. And I just want to note that right now, a bill called the No Hate Act is being debated in Congress. It just passed the Senate last week, and it aims to combat hate crimes against Asian Americans and improve reporting on hate crimes. But it's not without its critics who say that it relies too much on policing, which perhaps now sounds a bit tone deaf in the wake of the Derek Chauvin trial, which the verdict was read today. So with this context, I now want to turn to our panelists. Thank you all for being here so much. And they'll talk a little bit about their own experiences with discrimination and best practices when it comes to raising awareness about anti-Asian violence. And so Congressman Ted Lieu, would you like to go ahead?
Thank you, Ashley. And let me first say I'm so honored to be on this great panel with Manju, Rizwan, Madeline, and Kimmy. And I also want to thank Ashley for moderating today and to the East-West Center. And I appreciate everyone who's also watching this. I just want to say the East-West Center does tremendous work. I'm very pleased to have been able to sign on to a letter by Congressman Cahaley that's asking for $21 million for appropriations in Congress to the East-West Center so you can continue your tremendous work. Ashley gave a pretty good rundown of the problem that has happened since the pandemic with the rise in hate crimes and hate incidents, as well as a history of violence and discrimination against Asian Americans. I want to explain why I think this moment is somewhat different than prior moments. And if you look at what happened in the last few weeks, we saw a number of rallies across America. They weren't massive rallies, but they weren't small either. And they were popping up in places you wouldn't really expect. So for example, in my district of Redondo Beach, where there's just not a lot of Asian Americans, they just up and decided this weekend to do a rally in support of the Asian American community. And when you see this happen and you see a lot of non-Asian Americans come out in support of the community, that gives me hope. You also had the President of the United States issue an executive order to combat violence against Asian Americans and devote resources at federal agencies to fight hate incidents and discrimination against the Asian American community. You also had the President of the United States mention and talk about the Asian American community in a primetime speech. And then the President and the Vice President visited with Asian American leaders in Georgia after that horrific shooting. So you're having a lot of attention from the very highest levels of our government, including our Vice President, who is both Afro-American and Asian American. And then in Congress, you have the highest number of Asian Americans in US history, and you have a number of pieces of legislation that have been introduced. Last week, I introduced a bill on hate crimes along with Congresswoman Lucy McBath. If you look at the hate crimes law at the federal level, one reason it's not used that frequently is because the standard is very high. Essentially, race has to be the sole reason for why a defendant committed the crime, race or any other protected class. And oftentimes it's hard to meet that burden of proof. I'm a former prosecutor. It also doesn't comport with reality. The reality is defendants can commit crimes for multiple reasons. So Congresswoman McGrath and I introduced legislation that would change a standard to say that if race or gender or any other protected class is a contributory motivating factor to the commission of the crime, then you can charge the hate crime. It's got 25 co-sponsors already, and we're continuing to add more and more people every week. So you've got a lot of attention being paid to this issue. And I think had all of this been happening in World War II, I'm not sure if Japanese Americans would have been interned. I think we're in a different political environment. I think you're seeing the political awakening of the Asian American community. And I think people in the community who weren't active before are starting to realize that it doesn't really matter what income level you're in, where you live, what your status is, what you do. You or your parents or your child could be a victim of a hate crime or a hate incident. And in terms of the number of hate incidents being reported, as well as hate crimes, it's all underreported because many people don't report such incidents or they don't know how to. So I do want to thank Stop AAPI Hate for the great work that they've done in tracking a lot of these hate crimes and hate incidents. And we did see a recent report showing that this is affecting everyone, regardless of age. So you have elderly Asian Americans being assaulted, you have adults being spat upon, and then you have students being bullied. Recent reports show that 1 in 4 Asian American students report that they've been a victim of racist bullying. So this is a significant problem, and I think it comes down to what I call the foreigner syndrome, that when people look at you or me, their first thought may be that we're not American. We're second-class citizens. We're not of this country. We have dual loyalties. And that gives more permission for other people to attack Asian Americans. It also results in nefarious actions happening even within our own government. So for example, at the State Department, they have what's called assignment restrictions. Now, assignment restrictions can affect anyone. It could affect a Jewish American State Department employee or African American or Hispanic American. But what the evidence shows is that there's a disproportionate impact on Asian Americans, where Asian American employees are given these restrictions in their career where they say, you can't work on anything related to South Korea or China or Taiwan or whatever other Asian country there is. Representative Andy Kim a few weeks ago came out and said when he was in the administration, he was given an assignment restriction where he could not work on issues related to South Korea. And he couldn't figure out why that was other than his last name. When Secretary Blinken came to the House Foreign Affairs Committee last month, I spent the bulk of my time questioning him about these assignment restrictions, and the State Department is going to look into it and see if there's a way to do it in a fair manner that doesn't disproportionately impact Asian Americans. So this foreigner syndrome does sort of show itself in all different ways, and hopefully if we all work together, we can fight back and mitigate that. So I look forward to listening to the panelists, and thanks so much for having me on this panel.
Thank you so much, Congressman. All right, our next speaker will be Manju Kulkarni, excuse me.
Thanks so much, Ashley, and thank you to Liz for the warm introduction. I'm especially appreciative of the East-West Center for all their work and for the opportunity to participate in today's panel alongside this group of esteemed panelists. I especially want to thank Congressman Ted Lieu for his tremendous leadership. I don't have the benefit of living in his district. I'm adjacent to it, but really appreciate the amazing work that he's done. So next slide. I wanted to share with you some of what we've seen at Stop AAPI Hate. These are just a few examples that really represent the emergence of anti-Asian hate across the country. I'm not going to read the examples, but you can see here from the top left an example of a refusal of service by a ride-hailing company, the middle example of elderly grandparents accosted in their neighborhood, the one on the top right, a physician who is berated while treating a patient. Beneath that, a physical assault. Next to that one, going clockwise, a tech executive who not only uttered racial slurs, but also weaponized President Trump himself. And then the very last example is one in which really got us started at AppCon, my organization, on issues involving anti-Asian hate. A middle school child in Los Angeles was physically attacked and verbally assaulted on the schoolyard, and was told that he was a COVID carrier when he responded, and that he should go back to China. And when he responded that he was not Chinese, he was punched in the face and head 20 times. And what's really notable about that incident is, next slide, that it actually took place before there was a single confirmed case of COVID-19 in Southern California. So because of incidents like that, APCON would stop with Chinese for Affirmative Action and San Francisco State University co-developed Stop AAPI Hate. We began immediately to do outreach into limited English proficient communities and immigrant communities. And we created our forum in multiple Asian languages that you see there. Next slide. And what I wanted to share with you is a little bit of our data. As Ashley mentioned, through February of this year, we received 3,800 incident reports. They're from all 50 states and the District of Columbia, reported by individuals across ethnicities in the AAPI community. And women, of course, being targeted significantly and bearing the brunt of this racism. They've reported at 68% of all of the incidents. And as a congressman mentioned, all ages have been impacted, but we know that those who are vulnerable, such as seniors, women, and youth, have been particularly targeted. Before we move to the next slide, I want to point out too that most of the incidents that we've received are incidents and not hate crimes. That means that they don't involve an underlying criminal element. There's no battery, sexual assault, homicide, you know, what we typically think of as crimes. That, of course, doesn't mean we don't take them seriously and look for civil actions and other ways in which to address them. Next slide. And so I wanted to spend a couple minutes on the types of bias or discrimination, the locations, and then the ethnicities. You see here that verbal harassment tops the list. We have avoidance or shunning, then physical assaults. And the last four categories are those civil rights violations: workplace discrimination, refusal of service, vandalism, being barred from transportation. And what I want to point out here is these are not mutually exclusive categories. So individuals may sometimes experience harassment, but also assault or verbal harassment and discrimination in the workplace. Next slide. And when we look at where these incidents take place, you'll note here that businesses actually are at the top at 35%, followed by public streets. We have public parks, public transit. Overall, it's like 45, making up 45%. Then you see that schools and universities is a relatively low number at about 7% combined. We think this is because schools in much of the country are still in hybrid mode. We know universities are still holding classes virtually or online. And so we do expect that number to increase once we go back to in-person learning. Next slide. And so in terms of targeted ethnicities, I think it's important to note that while Chinese Americans may be the targets of the racism because of, you know, what was said earlier, comments by former President Trump and others, that this is actually impacting all parts of our community. So Chinese make up a plurality with 42%. Then we have Korean, Vietnamese, Filipino, Japanese. You'll notice the category of Asian. Those are individuals who are multiracial or identify more broadly. You'll see here that white, Hispanic or Latino, and Black or African American are also here. These are either individuals who are biracial or in most cases actually witnesses. So they also are providing firsthand accounts even though they're not experiencing the racism themselves. I do also want to point out one other thing, which is that Pacific Islanders and South Asians make up a small number of incidents that or report a small number of incidents we've received. They're under 1%, so that's why they're not included here. But so folks know why we continue to use the terminology AAPI hate, because they are included and they experience hate that's very similar. That is the PIs to Asian Americans. And it's also similar to what South Asians are experiencing. And so next slide. As I close out, I just want to share with you that this racism is having significant impacts across our community in terms of depression and mental health impacts. We also see increases in unemployment, small business closure, and we know that it's policies in addition to racial profile, including racial profiling, public charge, deportations, etc. Next slide. And so I just want to point out that we have a four-pronged approach that includes tracking and analyzing acts of racism, raising public awareness, providing community resources and assistance, and advocating for effective solutions at local, state, and federal levels. And with the last slide next, just want to share that, that includes legal assistance, anti-bias trainings, community mediation, public safety initiatives, and even local programs like the one we have in LA called LA versus Hate. As I close, I just want to encourage everyone to report to Stop AAPI Hate. We are the nation's leading aggregator of this information, which we provide in forums like today and also to policymakers. Last slide, there's my contact information. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you. All right, our next speaker will be Rizwan Manji.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for having me this esteemed panel. I'm very nervous. First, I thought it was a mistake that they were asking me to come join you guys, so I'm very excited. I wanted to talk to you guys about this discrimination that I have faced in the entertainment industry and how that sort of affects everything that sort of goes around the community. As the congressman said, there's this thing called foreigner syndrome, and that term I'm going to use forever now, so thank you for bringing it to my attention. But that foreigner syndrome, I think a lot of it is caused by what we see in the entertainment industry, what we see on TV, what we see on movies. It has such a big effect on us and the American community, because some of, like, Muslims, Asian Americans, sometimes the only people that they think that they know of that community is what they see on television and in film. So I'm just going to give you a little bit example of my own personal history. I have been in the entertainment industry for over 20 years, and right before 9/11, I was just starting to get a little bit of a breakthrough. I had been in this movie called American They See that had been reviewed in the New York Times, and I got a good review, and it was things were sort of lifting off, and I thought, oh, here is my big break, and we're going to move into something, and this is it. This is my career. And then what happened was 9/11 happened, and everything that in the entertainment industry post that I was being offered was to play a terrorist. There was so many roles that were coming out in a whole bunch of shows, to the point where I had to, even in commercials, I remember an eBay commercial where they had me auditioning to play a terrorist. And I finally, after that one, that's where I broke, and I called my agent and I said, I can't do this anymore. I can't audition for this. This is something that I can't do, because I feel like it's creating a scenario that is uncomfortable for me. But that's what then it kind of put a stop in my career, because there was not very much things that I could audition for. And again, this is what, even though I wasn't doing it, this is what the American people were seeing on their television. We still had shows like Homeland. We still had shows like 24, which I ended up being on. That's a whole different story. But those are the things that people are seeing. So that's how the foreigner syndrome comes up, is from that. Now, I'm in a different place right now, and I've been invited here, so I have made some headway into the entertainment industry. But I think that there's still this issue, because we've lost so much time. There hasn't been a natural progression, because every time stuff like this happens, we then still get placed in those foreigner blocks. And there has been some improvement. We have shows now. We have Never Have I Ever. We have movies like To All the Boys I Had Loved Before. We've had a bunch of stuff, but we're still having problems creating stuff of our own. we're still having that blockade. So, you know, again, my personal experience, I have a show that I have been trying to produce for many years, and we still get that blockade, right? There is this performative aspect of it where a lot of the studios want to say, we want to support Asian and South Asian content. We want this. There's that performative aspect of that. They do showcases with the actors where all this stuff happens. But when it comes down to it, we can't have a show once every decade that features South Asian and Asian talent, because again, that's just not enough. And if we continue to only see these actors in supporting roles, playing foreigners, playing this kind of thing, that's the only thing that we're gonna see. So unfortunately, that's been my experience, and I do feel like there's a positive trajectory in the entertainment industry, but it's moving too slowly, and we need to have something that that brings us to that next level. And that brings me to the allyship question that was mentioned. I think just recently, it's very in its infancy that we've joined together. For a long time, South Asians were not included in the larger Asian allyship, but in very recently we've joined together, and I feel like that's bringing us we're able to be a block together. This political season, I felt like there was the joining of the hands, and that to me has felt very positive. So I'm excited about this new allyship that's happening, where we're joining together as a force. And so that's where I am. That's my experience, and I'm hoping for a positive trajectory.
Thank you, Rizwan. All right, our next speaker is Madeline Milka.
Thank you so much, Ashley. I want to take the time to thank the East West Center and all the other panelists tonight, especially since I know I will learn from you as we continue this evening. So I really want to talk to you about the work that APACS does. And so the Asian Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies, we are a national nonpartisan nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting Asian American and Pacific Islander participation and representation at all levels of the political process. So from community service to elected office. At APACS, we prioritize developing leadership capacity, building public policy knowledge, and filling the political pipeline with APIs, which we feel in this current environment are all critical pieces to eradicating intolerance, prejudice, discrimination, and racism. Founded by former Secretary Norman Y. Mineta, who himself was incarcerated as a child in an internment camp. He started this organization in 1994, the same time as he started the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus, CAPAC, which is composed of all of the Asian American, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islander members of the U.S. House and U.S. Senate. And APACS has been a vital, important component in diversifying Congress. We have paid internships and paid fellowships that have brought hundreds of young AAPIs to the halls of Congress and have served to be a conduit to better understand the AAPI experience. APACS also plays a strategic role in bringing diversity, equity, and inclusion to the federal public policy arena. We work in partnership with our counterparts, the Congressional Hispanic Caucus Institute and the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation. So when you talk about allyship, all of our interns and fellows all meet as a part of their annual cohort so that we can all better understand and learn from one another. And that in itself helps to educate each other in our public policy and unique challenges within our own constituencies and also across in terms of coalition building. And it's through APACS programs and other leading fellowships that we have a record number of Asian Americans and Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders representing us at 21 members in Congress. And I'd like to also add that Congressman Ted Lieu is also an alum of our program in our Leadership Academy training. And so it's wonderful to always see him when he is up there advocating for the Asian American community. As the fastest growing demographic in the United States, APACS builds a community that both inspires and supports AAPIs and becoming civically engaged. In leading the national conversation on AAPIs, APACS connects leaders with stakeholders, engaging the public by uplifting the AAPI narrative. And through the creation of public policy and offering resources, APACS continues to build on the success of increasing AAPI participation and representation in public service. And the work that we do in regards to making sure that we have representation not only in the halls of Congress, but also in our state legislatures, in our local offices, are built around our programs to demystify the process and make government more accessible. So our programs and our leadership academies really teach people the tools that they need to run for office. And so regardless of where you might stand on any political issue, because we are issues neutral, we do believe that it's important to empower the AAPI community so that they can see challenges in their communities and feel that they can run for office and provide solutions. And so we want to be sure that running for office is not seen as a mystery, that there is not a wizard that is behind a curtain like the Wizard of Oz. It is basically, here are the ways to do it, the tactics and the strategy, so that you can empower yourself and others to be able to feel that you have the ability to provide public policy solutions. In this current environment, it's so critical for us as a community to become the voice for ourselves and for others, and become civically engaged so that we have the ability to voice our vote. We have the ability to also be the people who are at the table to decide what the public policy can be for all of us, and also to benefit other communities of color. So it's important for us in terms of coalition building to be able to allow our community to have the resources to better understand the process and the strategy to be able to become elected leaders themselves. And so the programs that we do at APACS really are defined about in the direction of making sure that it is community driven. We work with a number of community-based organizations that center the Asian American Pacific Islander experience, and working with them to identify and recruit talent into our programs so that we have representation. We've been very vocal in regards to the administration's lack of an AAPI cabinet secretary, and we have always been aware of that representation in the past 20 years. And so not having someone in that position, we felt was a slight to this community for all the work that it has done in the last election cycle. And it was something that we chose to use as a way to notify the administration that in terms of representation, they should build a bigger table. And so a part of the work that we do is to make sure that organizations and communities feel that they have the ability to be represented. And I look forward to working with you and making sure that we are always everywhere feeling like we can be a voice for change and for positive action.
Thank you so much, Madeline. All right, and our final panelist to speak will be Kimmy. Yeah.
Hi guys, I don't know why I just waved like a dork just now. I am so excited to speak with everyone tonight, especially since I've covered so many people on this panel. I feel like I interview Manju like every single day of my life. I think about a year ago, I published a profile on Congressman Liu, so it's exciting to be on the other side with you guys, and hopefully I can share, you know, kind of my perspective of what it's been like in the newsroom and, you know, overcoming some challenges that we still continue to see in media, and that are pretty pervasive in mainstream media. But I guess I'll start first with my background. I grew up upstate New York in a teeny tiny little town, and it was less than 1% Asian. I come from a family of Chinese restaurant workers. Everyone, my cousins' cousins were all Chinese restaurant workers, and we're Fujianese. If I remember correctly from my interview with Congressman Liu, he is also of Fujianese descent. But basically, when you come from those roots, I think a lot of the stereotypes that we get in Asian America are that model minority myth. But when you come from working class roots, I think that you get kind of the opposite. People see you as the help, the service. And I remember going to, ballet class. I was a pretty serious ballerina for a number of years. And I remember going to ballet class, and there was this family who had ordered food from my family's restaurant, and I think there was just missing utensils or something like that. And they were looking at me and trying to order me to go get them. And this was just me, a kid attending ballet class. But, forever, no matter what kind of scenario we were in, we were seen as, the help. And so for a lot of my life, that is the stereotype that I dealt with. People would shout menu items at my sister and I, prank call the restaurant all the time. That's a pretty universal experience for a lot of people growing up in that world. But, after kind of leaving home and going to college and, seeing the world, and then, entering the media industry, it's interesting now because I feel that my background has really better allowed me to report on this other side of Asian America that gets really left behind. The people who are workers, are working class, who don't have college educations. My parents didn't come over with educations. They didn't come over with a strong fluency in English. These are all things that we still deal with. And I think it's really helped me, just coming from this background, understanding that other perspective. I entered the media industry and went to HuffPost with this idea in the back of my mind, knowing that HuffPost at the time did not have an Asian voices section. There was basically every other section. You had a Black voices, a queer voices, Latino voices, women, parents, all these different voices, and there was nothing that was for the Asian American community. And I really wanted to go in and try to change that. So with my editor today, we launched that section, and it remains one of the 2 sections in the entirety of mainstream media that is dedicated to the Asian American experience. I think that right now, when I look at where I am, I feel very privileged to be at NBC, because when I go into the newsroom, I don't have to beg to cover my people. I don't have to beg to cover our stories. No one's going to tell me, okay, this isn't worth our time. But I also understand that that's not the case across most newsrooms. And I really want to make this point very, very clear. To have a newsroom, for journalists to come in and cover these marginalized communities, it shouldn't be looked at as just this added bonus. It shouldn't be something that people do in their free time or after they cover, things that are clicky. It should be folded into our daily media coverage, because a lot of the issues that we're seeing across, Asian America and the way in which we are misunderstood, it has a lot to do with the fact that mainstream media has not done its due diligence in covering these communities and doing so in a sensitive way. We're not, animals, exotic beings that should be covered in a National Geographic sense. We are just members of the community. And so it really matters that people who look like us cover us and do it in a sensitive, responsible way that is not salacious, none of that. It is, because journalists are really not any better than, regular everyday people, civilians. We are exactly as good as our communities. And so we need to be folded in there. We need to understand the sensitivities around these topics, and we need to be given space to do that. Diversity is an investment, and people need to understand that, it'll all come back and it'll all pay off. But at the end of the day, these stories shouldn't be looked at. People of color shouldn't be looked at as a business. We are part of America, and therefore we deserve that coverage. And so right now I feel very fortunate to be in the place that I am, but I understand a lot of newsrooms don't operate that way. And I really, really hope and challenge people to kind of change the way that they think about these stories, because, you know, people should read about Asian Americans every day outside of an uptick in hate. Outside of all of this, people should be reading about us. I think, you know, writing with empathy is definitely my #1 priority, and writing, you know, not with sympathy, but with empathy on the exact same level. I think that needs to change in a lot of media and newsrooms as well. I think, you know, looking back and looking at the challenges that Asian America has, it feels like there's a lot of them because we've been so invisible for so long. And not only are we making sure people see us, but also correcting a lot of these false narratives that people have about us. So there's a lot of work to do. But as I sit here today wearing a Yankees jersey during a season where we are dying every single game and probably have absolutely no chance to take it all home, I think that it's a very Asian thing to have love for something and have love for a country that's very flawed. But to actually amplify our voices and make it known that we are important so that, you know, that country can one day, with all its flaws, still improve and love us back. And so I guess that is, if you take away anything, I think that's it. Raise up our voices so that we're able to do that.
Thank you so much, Kimmy. And thank you for your work. I think I've literally read every story you've ever written. All right, so now we're gonna move on to our Q&A portion of the evening. And we already have a question from the audience. And I wanna direct it to the congressman first because he sort of answered it, and to elaborate a little bit. So the question is, do you feel that a change in language from Asian-American to American of Asian descent or of ancestry, excuse me, or of Asian descent would help Americans of Asian ancestry be seen as Americans first, and thus having commonality with all other Americans and bringing all of us closer together rather than differentiating and creating more divisions? Congressman Liu, you answered briefly that you have you think this would be helpful and that you've used the term Americans of Asian descent before. Can you elaborate a little bit on why you did that and why you do think this would be helpful?
Sure, I think it could be helpful, and I have used the term Americans of Asian descent in my prior speeches and remarks. We had a hearing in the House Judiciary Committee last month on the rise in Asian American violence, and we had some experts testify that when a former president will use terms like Kung flu or Chinese virus, that would then be correlated to a spike in hate incidents against Asian Americans. And I do think language could matter when you use the word American before Asian. That could signal to some people in America, sort of remind them that Asian Americans are like any other American. We're all Americans at the end of the day. So I think it could be helpful. I have no actual data for this, but I do know that when the reverse happens, when you do say things like Kung flu or Chinese virus, that does cause negative effects.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question from the audience. And this is going to be directed towards Rizwan, since he is a Canadian. So are any of the panelists aware of any problems experienced by Asian Canadians? Rizwan.
Yeah, I think Manju's going to answer. She had said in more detail, but I wanted to take the entertainment perspective on this. I am Canadian. I've been living in the States for a while, and what I find frustrating about the Canadian entertainment industry in terms of Asians is that, despite being you know, multicultural and all that good stuff, they still have very low representation of Asian Americans on TV. Yes, they had Kim's Convenience that we can all celebrate. Unfortunately, it ended this year. But one show every decade. I think they had Little Mosque on the Prairie like maybe 12 some odd years ago, and then 12 years later to have Kim's Convenience. It's just, it's unfortunate that we can't have a more of a presence in Canadian television and film, and it's still these like side characters that we still don't get to tell our stories at the level that we should be. You know, as Kimmy said, we need to be out there telling our stories. So that's my perspective on Canadian television, and a reason why I sort of moved to the States to pursue entertainment, because there's just more opportunity. There was more opportunity for me. But I think Manju had something.
Yes, Manju.
Yes, if I could just, I'm going to share one slide to answer the question. And this is just from a presentation I did for the World Bank. And you'll see there that we also have research provided by some of our collaborative partners in Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. And so you see there that actually what's happening in those countries is quite similar. Verbal harassment rates, physical assault, very similar to what we have here in the US, women being attacked 60% of the time, similar to the US at 68%. And while East Asians make up a significant majority, that other Asians in Canada are also impacted, and in Australia and New Zealand as well. So I think this really goes to the point that this is unfortunately a global phenomenon. Where individuals from, that share the same sort of ethnic origins are really being targeted no matter where the country is. So I would just say, like, when we think about some of the solutions to, it may not only be American policies, but also looking at organizations like the World Bank, the UN, and others to think about what we might need going forward.
Thank you, Manju. All right, we have another question from the audience, and this one's going to be for Madeline. How can Asians in Asia help mobilize support and advocacy for Asian Americans judged and even persecuted in the West?
Really good question. I think, with social media, I think, with the BTS Army, I think that was also one of the highlights of this entire situation, of that there is a global effect of how Asians in America as well as Asians in Asia feel about any sort of discrimination or bias. And I think that sort of connects us in that sense of, regardless of country of origin, you feel connected with, some sense of sisterhood, brotherhood, with your Asian American and Asians in that community. I think that's where the solidarity comes in. It doesn't matter if you're a global phenomenon or not. People are going to have bias and misconceptions about you from just looking at you. And I think understanding that when you have solidarity and signs of allyship in support of our communities, I think that is, the beginning part of recognizing that this is a global effort also. And I think, Manju's previous slide also shows that it's important for leaders, especially in, communities where they have influence, to be able to voice that.
Okay, thank you. And that question was also directed at Congressman Liu. Did you have anything that you wanted to add to that?
I think Madeline captured it. I just note it is a construct, right, in America to have the term Asian American. Because if you're in Asia, you don't actually think of yourself that way. You think of yourself as, Japanese or Chinese or Vietnamese. So it's just an interesting point that I raised. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. All right, we have another question, and this is for Manju. What needs to be added to the US school curricula to help students develop empathy and deeper understanding towards this issue, and how to change hearts and minds?
Thank you for that question. So, what I would say, point to first off is a report that I've tried to add the link to in the Q&A called "They Blame Me Because I'm Asian." So we held a youth internship program last summer, 100 kids across the country from high school. And as part of the internship, they interviewed 900 of their friends to find out if young people were also experiencing this hate. And sadly, they were. But what was really hopeful is that they gave recommendations on what they thought, really to the adults, on what needed to be done in schools. And so those recommendations are offered in the report. Again, it's done by high school students. And one of those key components is absolutely ethnic studies. Rounding out what we learn in high school. Ashley, you gave really great examples of so many things that are actually left out of our curriculum, right? That none of us learn about, whether it's in elementary, middle, or high school. And so I think that's one of the first steps. I think there are also other things that can be done when we look at, really fortifying, providing resources to clubs within schools that help young people. Mental health resources came up again and again for these kids. And so I think there are a whole host of ways in which we can tackle this problem. And I think that's one. I also wanted to just share another resource, which is an organization called Embrace Race. And they have a lot of resources for parents and educators on how to talk to young people, how to help them understand what's going on right now. Because I think it's so critical. We don't want to leave young people out of the equation. And oftentimes they actually have the answers that are better than the ones we as adults have for them.
Thank you. So the next question from the audience, this is directed towards all panelists, but maybe Madeline or Manju or Kimmy. Even if Asian Americans have a strong presence in America, it seems that they have been unable to educate others to reduce hate crimes, especially hate crimes that happen against the Sikhs, who are still mistakenly identified as Arabs. Do you all have, maybe Madeline, you want to take that one?
Definitely not a softball question. It is a remnant of something that we saw from 9/11. I think it was really important also to note that Secretary Mineta served in President Bush's cabinet, and in that, because of his own lived experience, President Bush notes and credits him for noting that he did not want to have anyone go through what Secretary Mineta went through as a child in an internment camp. And that in itself sort of, had a clear-cut directive from an administration saying we are not going to profile Muslims and Muslim Americans. And so I think in reaction to that, I would say we need more representation. Having a Sikh elected officials, having Sikh individuals who are working in public policy allows for more lived experience to be able to share that, to make people more aware. Oh, okay, I have a Sikh colleague who is sharing with me their experience of discrimination, prejudice, bigotry, and this cannot happen. And so I think that is a part of why we advocate for representation across all of our ethnic groups and communities within the Asian American experience, because it will provide an example.
Thank you. Kimmy, did you have anything Kimmy first, and then I'll get to you, Manju. Kimmy, do you have anything to say about this, perhaps informed by your reporting?
Yeah, so in speaking with experts, a lot of them note that the burden of a lot of this does not fall just on the marginalized group. And I think that that's a really, really important thing to note. When we're talking about where Asian Americans are in kind of this power structure in America, we're not on top. We don't control things in the US. And so that's why allyship and just hearing, a variety of voices to unite behind a common cause or purpose, I think that's going to be key to making sure that our stories and our voices, but also the importance of what we're trying to express, that's going to be key in making sure that's heard. I think that there is kind of like this idea that Asian Americans need to pull themselves up. And I think that happens even within our own community, that we have an idea that we need to, you know, pull ourselves up by the bootstraps and stuff like that. But in reality, even when we're looking at media, I mean, so few of us actually exist in mainstream media outlets. And not only that, so few of us are allowed that space and time to accurately and sensitively report on these issues. And so that's going to be super key, is that allies make sure that these stories can really come to the surface and, you know, understand that our stories are part of America, and so they are worth advocating for. Another thing that I'd like to point out, especially about the Sikh American experience and just the South Asian experience in general, you know, Asian America has been fairly exclusive. If you look at how Asian America was formed, it was very East Asian focused, and even the activists who coined that term were predominantly East Asian. And as, you know, immigration patterns changed and as the term became more and more inclusive, the way that it's used hasn't necessarily followed or tracked with that. And so when we're talking about Asian America, I think for a lot of people, it's really important that we mean everybody in Asian America, not just East Asians or not just one, you know, sect of Asian America. It's everyone. And so, you know, the Sikh experience right now, you know, the Sikh community, they've been attacked recently. So when we're talking about hate towards a group, or we're talking about attacks on Asian Americans, that means the Sikh American community. And so there needs to be kind of an amplification of that as well. It's not just an East Asian thing. And I don't know if you guys noticed, but it seems that there's fewer voices for this topic than there was maybe a month ago for those horrific shootings as well. And so I think it's really a confluence of many different factors that really have to go into this. But, you know, allyship within Asian America and then across different groups is always going to be important.
Thank you. Manju, you had something to add to that?
Yes, well, I wanted to build off of what Madeline and Kimmy said and what the congressman said earlier, which is, you know, I do think that what we're seeing today is a different time than, you know, 10 years ago, certainly 50 to 80 years ago, when we faced some, you know, very significant problems in Asian American history. And I think it is that, you know, we have policymakers now who are being vocal, like Congressman Liu, like, you know, others who are part of KPAC. I think we also, and of course, our vice president. And what we have now too is our journalists. And I really want to thank Kimmy for not only the work that she's done, which has been amazing for many, many years in terms of thinking about these issues and providing a framework that has heretofore not been there for a lot of articles in our mainstream papers. And I think her point earlier too is so important, which is there is a different lens that journalists bring to these stories. And I can tell you, you know, from the side of being interviewed by folks, you can tell when there's a reporter who understands and has experienced some of the anti-Asian hate phenomenon. And you can tell sometimes when there aren't folks who just sort of lack an understanding and perhaps even sympathy or empathy for those who are experiencing this. I've literally had some journalists say, like, so why is this important? Like, why, you know, I've been told to cover this. And it's like, I can't explain, you know, I have to explain to you why this is an important issue. And I do want to say one thing too, which is, you know, some in our community point to the fact that maybe in the past, some of us have been silent about our experience. But what I want to say is, like, we've actually been silenced, right? We've not been allowed to talk about what we've experienced, much like, you know, we learned about women in the Me Too movement. You know, 80% of women experience sexual harassment. And, you know, so many folks in mainstream media and a lot of men said, wow, women have experienced sexual harassment. And it's like, yes, but we were not allowed to talk about it. And so the same thing applies here, which is we sort of knew where our bread was buttered, right? That if we talked about racism we experienced, we were not going to get promoted. We were not going to get that job. We were not going to get a good recommendation from our professor or our teacher. And so I think what you're seeing now is people being willing to speak up and others being willing to listen. And so I just want to sort of allow us to have pause in this moment, that we are in a different place. And this is an opportunity to galvanize and to take advantage of it, both in terms of policy as well as, I think, cultural issues, really being open to this new dynamic.
Thank you so much. So we have another question from the audience, and this one is for the congressman. How do we address the issue on race if there are other social cleavages that exist? For example, economic class, political differences, gender. This is a very big question. What are your thoughts, Congressman?
Well, you would just have to try to address them all, right? I mean, I know it's a simple answer, but you would just tackle each of those issues the best that you can. Now, I do note that numbers also do matter. So I'll give you an example. During the campaign, the presidential campaign, as well as shortly afterwards, the Congressional Asian Pacific American Caucus met with Joe Biden. And we were talked to Joe Biden about folks that we thought would be good, for different cabinet appointments and so on, and other positions. And I think, if I recall correctly, maybe there were about a dozen of us. I can guarantee you, when he had those exact same meetings with the Congressional Black Caucus, he was seeing like 3 times that number. And with the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, at least twice that number. And so that's just going to have an impact. And what we're seeing, though, is the numbers are changing, though. So if you look at the Asian American community, it's had extraordinary growth since 2000. In the last 2 decades, Asian Americans have more than doubled in America. A few years ago, the Pew Research organization reported that more immigrants came from Asia than any other region in the world to the United States. And so that growth is continuing. And then Pew Research recently reported that by 2055, Asian Americans will be the largest immigrant group in America. And so when you see this kind of growth, you're just going to get more Asian Americans at all levels of society, whether it's in government or the private sector, in corporate boardrooms, as well as being judges. So the growth in numbers is generally helpful to the community, and I think that is something that also makes this point in time somewhat different than 50 years ago.
Right, thank you. All right, our next question is specifically for Rizwan. Rizwan, do you believe your personal experiences also reflect the broader entertainment landscape for people of all Asian backgrounds? Example, in performing arts, music, radio, fashion, etc., or is there a stratification of some kind depending on ethnicity?
So I mean, I guess I can only answer from my personal experience, but from being on this on this side of it and seeing, just in my world, where with writers and showrunners and all these aspects that I see, like even cameramen and like camerawomen, like there is not representation there. Do you know what I mean? And if that's the case in the stuff that I see, then I can only assume that there's underrepresentation in all areas. And I think that there was a question as well about the model minority myth. I saw it on the thing, which I will take as well. How do we solve that issue? And I'm sort of going to piggyback off Kimmy and say we can only do that by the truth, right? And the only way the truth comes out is if we can tell our stories. So if we, as the writer or the showrunner and the producers, get to produce our story, then it'll be true. It'll be what we see. And if it's the truth, then it'll be what it'll be what you will see, and hopefully that will balance out that model minority myth, because you'll have not just one story, you'll have 10 different stories, and everybody, like just with the panelists, we have 5 different stories. We do 5 different things. We are 5 different people. And if we all had stories that were told to the public, then you would see this balance of different ideas. But because you only get to see the one story that was probably not written by an Asian American, then you only see that one side of it. So I don't know if I answered both questions, but I feel like there just needs to be representation everywhere. And because my only proof that it's not there is because we don't see this, because I don't see it right now in my world, my answer to that question is that yes, it's being that it exists all over the place.
Thank you. So I have a question for Manju. And this is, sorry, going to make a hard turn to data. Manju, talk to us a little bit about where in the United States these acts of anti-Asian violence over the last year, we'll be specific about the data, have been happening. Are they just happening on the coasts where a lot of Asian Americans live, or perhaps in the interior of the country? I grew up in the interior of the country. Where are these acts of violence happening?
So, and I would just modify that a little bit to say that they're hate incidents and not always involving violence. So, you know, including, say, workplace discrimination, verbal harassment, but it's happening all over the country. Our data is from all 50 states and the District of Columbia, rural as well as urban, coast as well as interior. What I can tell you is where there are significant populations of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders is in fact where a number of incidents are happening. So for example, California has 30% of America's Asian American population. So it's not surprising that about 40% of incidents come from California. The other 5 states or other states that make up the top 5 are New York, Texas, Illinois, and Washington. So at least 3 of those other states, New York, Texas, and Illinois, have some of the largest populations in the country. So it's not surprising there either. I think Washington is a place where you see a lower population, but a more significant population of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So I think that's some of what's happening. And the fact that it is really across the country tells us that this is a nationwide problem and not a problem that's limited to any particular geography or a particular type of population.
Thank you. And I just want to jump off of that question and ask Kimmy about the coverage of these incidents. For those of us who our algorithms are trained to give us these stories when they break and et cetera, it looks like it's happening all the time and it might look like it's being covered really well. But in your assessment, you know, over the last year or so, what do you think of the coverage of these incidents? Is it enough? Is it not enough? Is it just right? Has it been blown out of proportion? What do you think?
That's a great question, Ashley. I honestly don't think it's been very good. I don't think it's been very good at all, because I think there's been a huge lack of nuance in this topic, and you're seeing a lot of these new outlets take on this subject. They don't have a lot of these Asian American staff members who are well versed in writing about their race or writing about their communities. And so what happens is a lot of sensationalism, and the way in which a lot of these videos are circulated, there is very little background when it comes to the way that these are reported. And that's why I think, you know, people might look at my pieces and go, okay, 2,000 words, are you serious? Do I have to read through all of this? Yes, you do. Yes, you do. There is so much background that has to go into it. I also fear, you know, there have been so many issues. Even Congressman Liu brought up a topic that's going on at the State Department right now. A couple years ago, I interviewed Congressman Liu while I was at HuffPost about something kind of similar, about the way in which a lot of Chinese American scholars and scientists were being profiled and therefore, charged with espionage when that truly was not the case, or there had been miscommunications in the way that, in the way that information was handled. So a lot of these issues precede the pandemic, but the way in which they're being reported makes it seem like there's a sudden uptick in all of these problems, when a lot of it is just being exacerbated, or, I think that there is kind of this tendency for outlets to chalk up a lot of all the violence to pandemic violence and that association to this quote China virus. But when you're looking at something like the shootings in Atlanta, it comes from a very long history of hyper fetishization and sexualization of Asian women. You can't say that originated with the virus. And so I think that what we really have to do is challenge outlets to understand that after all this is over, after the pandemic is over, and maybe after these hate incidents decrease, Asian America still has so much to offer. It's not a niche subject. It's not a niche group. There's so much that needs to be talked about. And I also understand that a lot of people are being introduced to our group through tragedy. And that's not completely what we're all about. There's so much depth to us. So I would challenge people to put in the time, get to know the community, and then report, versus just coming out with a story that is salacious and will bring you numbers. It matters that we all get this right, especially since this is one of the first times people are going to be hearing about our community. We don't, putting out a erroneous kind of image of what we are is not the right move. And, I hope outlets will do better in the future.
Thank you. And Madeline, I want to turn to you real quick, jumping off of that. And that is, do you foresee this surge in anti-Asian violence perhaps spurring any sort of, increased political activity from our community in any way?
I think we saw a result of that, from the election. There was a lot of hard work from the organizations in Georgia that really uplifted and motivated the Asian American community to vote. I think it's important to recognize that those types of actions are a part of a bigger process too, of encouraging the community to register and then to activate their voices. It doesn't just happen overnight. And so I think recognizing those organizations and all the hard work that they've put in, the years of labor to encourage our community to recognize the value of their votes. I think it's also, it has helped to motivate people within the community to use that as a way to unify us, to say, you are not going to invisibilize us. We are here and we are a part of this country, and we have every right to be able to voice our choices in the election. And so I think, we've had, for this new Congress, we have this record number of Asian Americans elected. We have the second time a Native Hawaiian in Congress after Senator Akaka with Congressman Kahele. I think it's important to recognize that Asian American women also are critical in representation. We only have 48 Asian American state legislators across 7,300 seats in state legislators. And that's an abysmal number. And yet at one time we used to have 3 US senators who were Asian American women, and one of them is now president of the Senate as vice president of the United States. And so we have very aspirational goals in making sure that we can secure more representation, and that is through voting, that is through being active citizens and being a part of the local work that's being done, because your sheriffs, your district attorneys, your judges, all of those things are all done on a local basis at times. And if you aren't participating in a way that shows that you have power and influence in your vote, and also in any sort of civic engagement, then you're letting someone else choose for you. So I think it's also, again, coalition building too, of also, being a part of community with other communities of color, and recognizing that even though there is anti-Asian hate and violence, that we are also seeing, if there are similar incidences within, the African-American community and the Hispanic community, being able to step up for them as well. Because any sort of public policy that is created, to benefit the Asian American community should really be looking at how does it benefit all of our communities, because it should be a discussion that is community driven, and also one that allows for people to see how they can participate by actively, sharing what they think will be best practices for us to address these issues at large.
Great, thank you. So it looks like we have time for one final question, and this will go to the Congressman. It's also from the audience. Congressman Liu, from your vantage point, has there been significant challenges with Asian American hate discrimination within the U.S. Armed Forces due to COVID-19, or in general, that maybe goes unnoticed by civilians and active duty service members?
I can give you my experience in the military. I served on active duty in the 1990s. I'm still in the reserves. And like any large organization, it's not going to be perfect. But in terms of race, the military has generally done fairly well. It was one of the first large organizations to integrate. And when you think about what the military has to do, they're literally taking people from all across the United States, many of them right out of high school, and they're forming them into these units where they've got to depend on each other for their lives. And because of that mission, what happens in the military, in my experience, is, for example, if I'm on a military base and I see another person, the first thought that comes to my mind is that person a civilian or a member of the military? And then the second thought is, if they're a member of the military, what branch of service are they in? And then the third thought is, what rank are they? And do I salute them, or do they salute me? I don't sort of, when I look at some of the military, it takes a while before my brain registers what race they are. And I just know when I serve, my sense is most people didn't view me as, the Asian American captain. They viewed me as Captain Liu, who did so-and-so mission. And the military is able to sort of do these things through the training they put you through. They make you wear a uniform so everyone sort of looks the same. They instill a lot of patriotism and teamwork and this and that. So you don't really think about race very much. At least that was my experience in the military compared to civilian organizations. So in terms of race, it's, I think, done for a large organization fairly well. It's got problems with gender. It's got problems with other things. But I would give it generally pretty good marks on the race issue.
All right, thank you. And we actually have time for one more question. And I'm just gonna ask this question to sort of end all of this, and whoever, whichever panelist would like to answer, just raise your hand. My question is about, what our community ourselves, what a little bit introspection here, what we can do to do a better job of being allies to other members in our community that we may not feel so close to. I mean, as you all know, we're not a monolith. And sometimes that it's hard to wrap your head around what AAPI actually means. But do you have any advice on what we could do for ourselves moving forward to help sort of, get through this, push through this, where we could do a better job of coming together? Who would like to take that? Manju?
Thank you, Ashley. So yeah, I mean, what I would say in terms of offering solidarity to other communities, if we can sort of take that lesson of the model minority myth that was asked before, I want to delve into it just for a second, which is, folks may know that part of it was really wedging or creating a wedge between Asian American and African American communities. Professor Peterson of University of California coined the term in 1966 to say Asian Americans were doing well, socioeconomically, so they were a model. African Americans, according to him, were not, so they were a problem. But the second part of that is really important, which is that Asian Americans were a model to him because they didn't speak up. They didn't speak up after the Japanese American incarceration, and they were silent, and they were a model for that reason. And that African Americans were a problem because they demanded their civil rights. This was actually at the height of the civil rights movement. He had the audacity to say that, and to say that they were a problem because they sought out programs like the Great Society. So I think when we think about this moment, one is that it is an opportunity for us to speak up and speak out against what is happening not only to our communities, but to other communities. So, we all thought just, hours ago, we were relieved by the guilty verdict of Derek Chauvin. And yet, while we were on this panel, a 15-year-old African-American girl was killed by police after she called for help in Columbus, Ohio. So her name is Ma'Khia Bryant. And so now, these things are happening over and over and over again. And I think when we look back, not just at the model minority myth, but what happened in the 60s, Black civil rights leaders allowed many of us to come into the United States by demanding the Immigration Act of 1965. My family would not be here had it not been for their activism in demanding that after the Voting Rights Act, after the Civil Rights Act. So it's our turn to pay it forward. And I would just leave everyone with that thought, which is it's a time for all of us to come together, for us to demand civil rights and really being free from police violence, being free from hate for not only Asian Americans, but for Black Americans and Latino Americans and other marginalized communities.
Thank you. And Kimmy, you have the last word, a couple of minutes.
Okay, I'm gonna try to do this succinctly, but I've never been good with sticking to the word count, so let's just hope and pray that I get this right. Okay, so a couple things. First, thought that came to mind, something that Manju brought up was kind of the roots of the model minority in that term, and also Japanese American forced incarceration. So during that time, I think that the way in which white supremacy shifts, and this is well documented by historian Ellen Wu, it shifts and it places people in opposition to each other when that's not necessarily what's going on. So for Japanese Americans, for example, actually white liberals at the time lifted up stories of their success to kind of cover up the sins of the past, in addition to, suppressing this growing civil rights movement of the time. When we think about our history in this country, Asian Americans, while we have roots that go back pretty deep, most of the population is immigrant, a huge amount of the population. People, have complained like, oh my God, why are you guys so silent? I think about this in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, in which, we haven't been here very long. We're just putting down roots. We're learning the language. We're learning the culture. And we're learning ways in which we can exist safely and securely. And when that happens, it's difficult for people to really speak out. And so now we're coming on a generation that has that privilege to do that. And so now we have the privilege to learn about each other and to relate to each other. And I think that it's going to be our generation, this new generation coming up, who's going to learn about other different groups across the Asian diaspora. And right now, I think we're just learning about what solidarity is. We're just learning about what Asian America looks like altogether. But ultimately, I think that we are going to be that group that takes the initiative, because people in our past, people in our history did not have that privilege. And so we have to be both understanding to people who, when they weren't able to speak out, and also do more to move the community forward.
Thank you, Kimmy. And that concludes our Q&A section. Thank you so much to the panelists for joining us tonight. And thank you, East West Center, for having me as well. And now I'm going to pass it back to Liz Dorn to close out.
Mahalo to our moderator, Ashley, and to our panelists, Congressman Liu, Manju, Rizwan, Madeline, and Kimmy, the Center is honored to have played host to such an informative and timely discussion. And thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your experiences. Thank you as well to our viewers for attending today's EWC Seminars Live. We hope you will join us Saturday, April 24th for Health Reporting, Challenges and Lessons from India and Pakistan, featuring journalists participating in the Center's India-Pakistan Cross-Border Reporting Program. Please take this opportunity to hear from journalists from Karachi, Lucknow, New Delhi, Srinagar, and others. And on behalf of the East-West Center, thank you so much. Aloha and mahalo.